So, since we got some news, some new information about Final Fantasy VII's remake project, because of course now we got to see the first few glimpses of Final Fantasy VII Revelation, we also got the first new impressions, the first few opinions of people, and this brings me to today's topic. In my oldest videos, I always talked about how people always come to the conclusion that the Final Fantasy VII Remake project is about time traveling, time manipulation, alternate timelines, and so on. And the newest thing that I've seen is that one of the more popular translators for the Final Fantasy VII Remake project in regards to bringing news to the fandom also talked about how Zack has been depicted to confirm or to state that there are multiple timelines. I want to make this very clear here, because since 2020 it's always been the case that many people are very persistent and very much insist on how it is very obvious that Final Fantasy VII is about time traveling, how it is about Gaia having many or multiple timelines, and that it's even been confirmed. Let me just say this: it has never been confirmed. Square always uses the word Sekai, which in the most literal sense means world. And in the most recent interview, whenever they talk about, or technically, whenever Hamaguchi-san talked about Zack, he talked about Sekai Sen. Now, Sekai Sen, in the most literal sense of the word, means world line. And technically, Sekai Sen could be understood as timeline. However, of course, you cannot just go with, oh, he used the word Sekai Sen, which first of all is not an unequivocal word, and then call it a day. You have to go with what the rest of the games actually say, with what the rest of the interviews actually state. To bring up one example, Square on stage a few years ago was asked how many timelines there are in the Final Fantasy VII Remake project. And when they were asked about timelines, they immediately responded by using the word Sekai, so world again. And when they talked about Sekai, they also were referring to the incarnations of Stamp, so that little dog, and said that in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth there are 7 stamps. Now this brings me to the next thing. If you've noticed something in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, there very obviously was not a stamp that stood for the original Final Fantasy VII. So the original Final Fantasy VII cannot be a parallelly existing timeline, which should already seem weird if Final Fantasy VII Remake is actually about timelines. Also, the planetology, or as it was called in the original game, the studies of planet life, do not really allow alternate timelines or time traveling to exist. Now, I'm very well aware that it is Square's own product and they can always expand on the lore, they can always retcon it, and technically they have already done that to an extent, but the growth of the planet and the growth of the live stream depends on the addition of information to the live stream. Now, if all kind of information already exists and is transcendent of time, then the lore of Final Fantasy VII does not make any sense, because the planet cannot grow if it already has access to all information at all time. So that in and on itself does not make any sense. It opens up a full can of worms. But even Sephiroth's own explanation and his behavior in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth where he says there are multiple worlds, multiple sekai, and that from time to time new worlds are born and eventually they perish and return to the planet again. That in and on itself also does not make any sense, because let's just assume he was actually talking about literal timelines that would amount to literal physical universes existing, which would mean those literal physical universes would perish and would then become a part of that one physical planet of Gaia again. As you might have noticed, what I just said has no real meaning. A full-on separate physical plane would cease to exist and then become part of another physical plane. Of course, it is fiction and ultimately could always be written like that, but why go for such an explanation when there is a much more lore-consistent explanation, which is also why I'm even bothering making this video. The next very odd thing that is completely against the idea of literal alternate timelines is Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, where Square expanded on the idea of multiple possibilities and Sephiroth exploring those possibilities while he's actually in the live stream and while Aerith is in the live stream. And we saw some of those possibilities, and those possibilities very obviously were not physically existing universes, physically existing planets, or physically existing incarnations of Gaia. So, now obviously I cannot stop anyone who wants to give into this pop culture trend of thinking that everything that has an element of repetition or multiple incarnations automatically amounts to the existence of multiple timelines. But let me just tell you, the existence of those multiple worlds, or Sekai Sen multiple world lines, does not automatically need to mean there are alternate timelines. It's actually quite the opposite if we go by what has been established over the last 30 years in Final Fantasy VII. And let's just say Final Fantasy VII Revelation turns out to have a fully and completely different meaning than what people expect. And my first assumption was that it was about Cloud's mind, but I'm fully in for it meaning alternate spiritual planes in the live stream or the collective consciousness of people. Then nobody should be too surprised, because Final Fantasy VII is always about the distinction between reality and everything that simply is not reality, about memories, memory alterations, things that are and just are not the case. And ultimately that's also not just more lore consistent, but it's also more creative. So I personally would not be too insistent on Final Fantasy VII Remake being about alternate timelines, because not only is it inconsequential, it's also less creative. And I mean, come on, let's be honest, we do not need to get the next time revolving story. And not everything that has an element of repetition and not everything that talks about future and that talks about time always is about literal time. And Final Fantasy VII ultimately is a Japanese game, a Japanese story, a Japanese concept. And when it comes to storytelling, it very, very often is the case that until something is fully explained, there are always terms being used that can be understood in either this way or that way. And of course, Square could fully contradict me in that regard, but when it comes to what has been established in Final Fantasy VII Remake, in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, in the original Final Fantasy VII, and the way they conducted themselves in interviews over the last few years, I always go by, yes, there are multiple worlds, but they are not the same thing as multiple timelines. It does not make any sense for them to be alternate timelines. It does not make any sense for them to exist on a separate physical plane, but instead that they are separate spiritual planes. And I think ultimately it is also for the better if it turns out to be something along that line. Oh yes, and to be sure, I also want to point out that I reached out to the translator that talked about the timelines, that talked about the translation, and we pretty much agree on everything, that it is all livestream revolving. So this video is not supposed to be taken as some sort of insult or jab, and I hope that the translator can continue to do a good job. Anyway, that's just a very short video of mine, but I basically said everything that I wanted to say, and if there are any more questions, of course I can explain it in further detail, but for now it's sufficient. Thank you for watching.